Hey everybody, it's Deconius, aka Decoy, aka Saxon, whatever. So I've been seeing a lot of people doing videos about explaining how stands work. And it's a viable resource, because if you like a stand and you don't see anybody really appreciating it, it gets frustrating. And with stands, sometimes it's hard to really understand what makes them so great when the rules are kind of confusing and sometimes Araki's not very consistent with their abilities. And I wanted to do something similar because I feel I have an interesting take on how stands work in some cases. But the problem being, I didn't want to do what everyone else is doing, where they just explain how they work or why they're useful and all that stuff. I wanted to go a little bit further. I'm somebody who overthinks things. I really do. And it makes me theorize things and kind of fill in the plot holes where Araki leaves. Now, you can say that this is kind of dumb since Araki may not have thought so deeply about this or simply just forgotten certain things, and so they don't really match up as much as you want them to. I think that, that's kind of shortchanging it, Even if he didn't really think that deeply about it, I don't think that theorizing is such a bad thing when it can lead to some interesting outcomes. But I like to do this because it brings some new, fresh blood into these stands characters, and I think it could really go somewhere with it. For my first entry in this series, I'm going to call Do You Understand? We're going to talk about Star Platinum. Technically, the first stand.
Do you understand?
Also, before I begin, spoiler warning, of course. If you haven't caught up to JoJo, I would even say part 7, then you probably shouldn't watch this. But especially if you haven't caught up to part 6. There are spoilers abound, and if you're an anime-only watcher, you're gonna get heavily spoiled. So, you've been warned. Now, Star Platinum is a very basic stand. As most people say, it's a punch ghost. The original punch ghost. And why is that? Well, its abilities are basically punching very well. And while that's kind of shortchanging it, basically that's true. It just punches very well. It punches super good, guys. Now, there's some parts about Star Platinum that don't really make sense. It can stop time, its ability Star Finger. Why exactly is it have those abilities? They don't seem very congruous with punching very well. Some people have theorized that, he punches so fast that he basically seems like he's stopping time, but I don't think that's necessarily true. And why, out of all the people that Dio could have fought in the final battle, he fought the person with the same stand as him? That seems a little bit far-fetched. People have always said that Dio's ability isn't necessarily the world, but the ability to steal stands from the Joestar bloodline, such as, Hermit Purple and Star Platinum's Time Stop ability, and some have made the case that he stole Crazy Diamond's appearance a little bit. Now, this has been proven not true, as Araki has claimed that the Hermit Purple we see in Stardust Crusaders that Dio uses is Jonathan's stand, and that it's simply just when Dio got hit by the arrow, Jonathan's body also got a stand, and that eventually probably would go away when Dio fully overtook the body. And also that Hermit Purple is basically a representation of Hamon user's ability. If you had gone back to part 1 and 2 and with, a stand, you would see Joseph or Jonathan using Hermit Purple even if they didn't know it. So that's debunked. And also the world, as we can see from part 7, is probably Dio's default stand if, he sort of comes out the same way. So he didn't really steal that from Jotaro. So what does that make Jotaro then? Do they just have the same stand? It's not necessarily uncommon. There are characters with very similar stand abilities, but not so many that have actually fought against each other. And so it just kind of seems out of the blue and sort of ham-fisted that Jotaro suddenly gets Time Stop. But there's an interesting aspect to it. Jotaro does get Time Stop, but it looks like as if he has trouble with it, as if it's a very difficult thing for him to do. It almost seems like it's not natural for Jotaro. I mean, he struggles to move through time, and at the very end only manages to stop time for 5 seconds at least once. He doesn't use it for 10 years, and struggles to make it back to that 5-second limit, and struggles to use it multiple times in a row. And I mean, Dio can do it because if it's a sort of an endurance or strength related thing. Dio's an immortal vampire monster. He has the regenerative abilities, the super strength, the super endurance, all of that. And when he's finally at his prime, he can stop time for however long he wants, as much as he wants. Jotaro's just human, but why does he have this ability too? Why does he even have a stand? It honestly doesn't seem like he likes it very much or doesn't want to use it. I mean, he uses it when it's necessary, but it seems very apparent that Jotaro isn't so much a fan of his stand. So why is it he has time stop and all this super strength? Why does he have the ultimate stand? Why does he have all these abilities that don't really seem to make sense? Well, it all ties into my theory that Star Platinum, much like Jotaro, is an inheritor. And much like how Jotaro inherits the battle of the Joestars against Dio and the evils that Dio creates, Star Platinum inherits the abilities of the previous Joestars in order to finally defeat Dio. So, in order to back up this theory, let's look at Star Platinum's abilities. First of all, super strength, super speed, self-preservation. These things all stand sort of have. But let's look into his punch rush, his attack rush, the or kind of thing. We first see this being used by Jonathan with Sunlight Yellow Overdrive, where he punches really fast and several times. Now, of course, stands after Jotaro, and including Dio and even Silver Cherry to some point, have a kind of an attack rush ability where they punch a lot. But we can kind of say that this is just inspired by Jotaro's attack rush, and that Araki just kind of liked the attack and gave a lot of stands that attack. So if we take it from that, the original person to do it, the very first person, is Jonathan. And even to further this point, like in All-Star Battle, when these attack rushes, when they both happen at the same time, there's a little button thing that happens during the game. Jonathan's also included in it. He uses his Sunlight Yellow Overdrive to fight off any stand attack rushes. To further this inheriting thing, Star Platinum inherited not only, Jonathan's strength and speed, but also his attack rush ability. Now, of course, it's just a punching stand. If its ability is to punch well, of course it would have these abilities. Let's take it a little further. I say that Star Platinum also inherits some Hamon abilities, well, not necessarily Hamon itself, but simply the abilities that Hamon gives to Hamon users. Starfinger, for example. It seems out of place. It doesn't really make much sense, but it does seem a lot like the Zoom Punch that both Jonathan and Joseph use, where the Hamon numbs the pain from dislocating their bones so that their arm can go farther to, deliver a punch. Starfinger seems the very same way in this regard, although it's not necessarily a Zoom Punch, and in fact a Zoom Punch attack rush with Star Platinum would be super OP. It makes a lot of sense why you can suddenly do that, though he didn't use it enough to really, make it a staple or further this idea, but he at least explains it. And then there's also, during the fight with Justice, why can Jotaro suddenly just intake all this fog? Well, if Hamon is a breathing ability, and as we see from, training the Joestars in these breathing abilities, it requires, some crazy shit like breathing or inhaling for 10 minutes and exhaling for 10 minutes. If Joseph could do this, we can assume Jonathan could do something similar. And if Star Platinum is an inheritor of these abilities, we can also assume that Star Platinum inherited these incredible breathing abilities. Now, there's the precision and enhanced eyesight. Now it's a little bit harder to explain, but I'm going to say it's probably George. George didn't have Hamon abilities or anything, but he was an ace pilot. He was well renowned within the British Army and fought during World War I. To be that renowned, to be an ace pilot, and survive as many battles as we can assume that George did, he probably had to have some pretty good accuracy. The enhanced eyesight I'm not so sure about, but we can at least explain the precision along with the noticing small details and stuff maybe with Joseph's, ability to see details in the environment and exploit them and all that kind of stuff. Honestly, I would say that Jotaro's, default ability would be his eyesight and precision. Just because, as a person, he tends to notice things, he investigates things, he's very detective-like, as we see during several fights, such as the Justice fight and the Sheer Heart Attack fight. Jotaro can be very perceptive, and so I wouldn't be surprised if this is just a trait he has naturally. With that said, this helps explain a little bit why he suddenly gains the ability to stop time. When fighting against Dio, Jotaro's reasoning for how he could stop time, or at least move in stop time, is that once he learned that Dio could move through stop time, that it was something that he could try to attempt to do, and he was successful. And this is explaining, they're the same type of stance. But it could simply just be that Star Platinum slowly began to inherit Dio's time stop ability. Because once Dio inserted himself into the Joestar bloodline, he technically inserted himself right where Jonathan was, which means that Jotaro could technically inherit Dio's time stop ability. Now, of course, as I explained, he's not very effective at it. He can only stop time for at max 5 seconds, whereas Dio at max could stop for maybe 9 to 11 seconds. And he can't even do it that much. And even in Eyes of Heaven, the same reasoning is used for why Star Platinum can beat the world over Heaven, is that they're the same type of stance, so he can inherit. He can use the same overriding reality ability. But it could be argued that Jotaro is simply just taking or inheriting this ability from Dio, and any Dio that confronts him, which can be a pretty overpowered ability, honestly. And if the time stop ability wasn't enough, then the final punch against Dio could also be explained as something that Jotaro inherited from Jonathan, and I'll explain why. The final punch against Dio doesn't really make sense. They say, he used his already damaged kneecaps to hit him. Well, Dio is a monster. He just got a ton of blood from Joseph. He is at his peak. Do you really think that just a punch to his kneecap would just split him and explode him? No. I say it's latent Hamon abilities. The ability to destroy the vampires, or the creatures of the night, with the sunlight. In that final punch, he probably inherited Jonathan's fiery Hamon to finally defeat Dio, to send the Hamon through the world and right back into Dio and explode him. Thus, making that final punch make a little bit more sense, even if, at the time, it didn't have to make sense, it was just fucking awesome. And also why, probably, it didn't completely destroy him, since, Star Platinum nor Jotaro is really a Hamon user, but was able to just incapacitate Dio long enough for the sun to rise and then to burn him to a crisp. This inheriting, we can even note from Star Platinum's appearance. Now, Star Platinum's just like a big guy with some shoulder pads, a loincloth, and, hair. So he doesn't seem that interesting, but he does kind of resemble the Aztec themology, that sort of how all this stuff began, way back with cars. We lived in South America and stuff, and created the stone mask, and that's how Dio became a vampire, and how that's how it all started. But if you look a little closer, I noticed this while reading part 1. There's the scene where Will transfers his Hamon energy into Jonathan to help him defeat Tarkus. And he looks a lot like Star Platinum in this picture. In fact, he looks like Star Platinum afterwards, too. So, not only does he inherit some abilities, he kind of looks like Jonathan a lot in certain circumstances. So, I think that's a little bit intentional. I'm pretty sure it is. And ultimately, this inheriting, not only from the Joestars, but from Dio, coincides with the role Jotaro plays in Part 3 and up to Part 6, really. He inherits the battle against Dio. And he inherits the battle against evil and anything that threatens the Joestars. Jonathan defeats Dio during the ship and also perishes at the same time. And Joseph, the next Joestar we focus on, doesn't necessarily inherit the Joestar burden to fight against Dio, but he does inherit Jonathan's, good nature, his kindness, his willing to, fight for justice and all that, and he does break the curse of the Joestars in which they die at a young age. So he does serve his purpose, but Jotaro really is the inheritor of this fight against Dio, this fight against evil, because, Joseph's old by this point, and while he's not, lacking in skills during part 3, he's definitely a capable fighter. It's Jotaro who has the youth and, the ability to keep up with Dio and fight against him. And it is his burden to take. I mean, part of the reason I wouldn't say Joseph is the inheritor is because, Joseph's a little lazy. He definitely fills a very important mentor role to the other Joestars. But Jotaro is the one who has to take this mantle to fight against this evil. Because honestly, it's not a mantle you want. Sure, we do see him throughout the rest of the parts. He does mentor Josuke and help him, sort of gain his calmness during a battle. And he aids Morio in defeating Kira and the outlying stand users caused by the stand arrow, probably because he feels a little guilty or blames himself for not finishing the job and stomping out all the outlying little evils that Dio left in his wake, such as the arrows and not getting them in time to stop more stand users from coming out. He is a guy who takes responsibility for actions that, even if they aren't necessarily his own fault, if no one's going to take it, he might as well. We see him take responsibility for Dio's death and ensuring that his possible son Giorno doesn't retaliate or become someone like him. And throughout part 6, even though he's kind of a shitty dad and absent most of Jolene's life, he is out there trying to keep them protected against, this fight that he has to endure. And even if he makes some dumb choices, he does it out of the kindness of his heart, because after taking up this mantle, the last thing he probably wants is for Jolene to have to deal with it, even though that is eventually what she has to do. And inevitably, this duty to his bloodline, this love for his family, is his ultimate demise against Pucci, who, having spent 20 years planning out this shit and finally gaining Maid Over Heaven, knows exactly how to use it against Jotaro. And despite how cool and calm and just fucking amazing Jotaro can be in combat, his greatest weakness is honestly his family. It's concurrent throughout the whole series. He locks himself in prison to make sure he doesn't hurt his mom. He goes on this journey to help his mom. He gets absolutely furious when Joseph dies, and especially when his body is desecrated. His anger is just fucking let loose. He can't control it. He even goes so far as to fucking take the brunt of the rat attacks to make sure that Josuke doesn't get hit, because he can't heal himself. This dude is, despite being aloof and not quite able to attach them emotionally, he does care about his family and his bloodline quite a lot, and he will defend it to the end, and which is why he's the perfect character to have this inheriting stand. Technically, if he wanted to exploit this ability further, he could have Hermit Purple abilities. He could probably have, further, Hamon life-giving abilities or some other stuff. Of course, he can't get the abilities of Josuke, Giorno, or Jolene because they're technically not, ancestors of his. He can't inherit something from someone further down in the bloodline, basically. That's not a direct link to. But he could get further abilities like Jonathan. He could be a fucking he's already a powerhouse. But he could be a further powerhouse. But it's the fact that we hear in part 4 that he hasn't used Time Stop in 10 years. Now, 10 years ago was the fight with Dio. And the fight with Dio is probably the last time he used Time Stop. So he hasn't used it since the fight with Dio. This incredibly overpowered ability. And he even struggles to use it. If he had just trained with it, he would be able to exploit it to its full potential. And we see in part 6 that he does, but he's still only 5 seconds. And the reason is, Jotaro is not a person to indulge in power, or lust for it, or strive to become even stronger. Jotaro is a person who is constantly trying to keep himself in control. This is a person who's constantly in control of his emotions, barely letting anything slip through. This guy is about control. And even if he has an OP ability like Time Stop, or even an OP ability like overriding reality, he wouldn't use it. Because it's not like him to do that. He doesn't want to overindulge in something and potentially become a risk to people, because he knows he has an incredible amount of dangerous and violent power. And because of this, unlike Dio, he's not going to exploit it. Dio was going to exploit the whole world with his ability, hence the name. But Jotaro is simply going to inherit it and use it to fight for justice. He's not going to exploit it. And that's why he is the inheritor, because he can be trusted with it. And, in a way, you can kind of be thankful Dio let him inherit this ability. He wouldn't have been able to do half the shit without it. So is there anything further that Jotaro could do? I don't think so. I think in Eyes of Heaven he has the maximum amount he could have. I mean, if he wanted to, he could use Funny Valentine's dimension hopping ability to find other Dios with other differing abilities and just inherit them and become overpowered as possible. But it basically requires him to fight against Dios, and I do not think that Jotaro would ever want to fight another Dio for as long as he lives. So there's that. I think Jotaro could be an absolute monster with Star Platinum, but the fact that he's not is what makes him a hero. And that's why I think Star Platinum is a little more interesting than just being a punch ghost. So, let me know if you guys like this kind of video. I definitely want to do more. I don't know if I'm going to do them in order of stands, because it's definitely a lot, and I don't know if I could necessarily get as much out of every stand ever as I could with something like Star Platinum. But let me know what you think. Let me know if you like it, and subscribe to see more. And in the comments, suggest other kind of JoJo videos you'd like to see. I love doing this kind of stuff, and I really want to do more of it in the future, so, let me know what you think. Anyways, I've been Taconius, and...
Do you understand?